I think it's safe to say that in the year of our Lord 2021, the question of can video games be art has reached a verdict with a resounding... yeah. So just like everything else artistic, there's always going to be room for interpretation and discussion on your experiences and feelings with any given title. Most relevant for today, though, a seemingly omnipresent discussion that seems to rampage across all of social media the nanosecond a journalist uploads a slightly controversial opinion article: how difficulty can affect a player's experience with a game. More specifically, whether or not a game being difficult or having more rigid and punishing mechanics can enhance the player's experience, even if it may lead to frustration or even burnout. I think it's an interesting talking point, and one that I've actually brought up on the channel from time to time. But it's one that can also become absolutely unbearable extremely quickly because it tends to attract literal biohazards who put a concerning amount of their self-worth into said discussion. Personally, I really enjoy it when the discussions are about game mechanics and how they're designed with a specific goal for the player, and I like it substantially less when it becomes a digital dick measuring contest, seemingly with the express purpose of belittling others' achievements. Fortunately though, that's only anecdotally relevant, as I'm not here to rationalize what my hypothetical gamer score, EP's girth and length is. The point that I want to get at is that even despite the vocal minority, to an extent I can sort of understand why this topic is so controversial. How you choose to engage with a video game can impact your thoughts and feelings with it substantially, and of course that trait isn't at all exclusive to the medium, but the reason why it's such a prevalent talking point with games specifically is because they're inherently interactive experiences. How much interaction you may have is ultimately completely dependent on the game, but you know what doesn't happen in books or TV shows or movies, for example? Say you sit down at the movie theater, ready to watch a sequel to a film that you absolutely adored, and much to your delight, those obnoxiously loud, TikTok-addled asshats who ruined your last theater experience were kidnapped and dropped into the middle of the Pacific Ocean, never to be seen again. But what's even better is that the movie so far has been absolutely fantastic. Things are ramping up, tensions are raised, and then finally a climactic scene that has been teased for years begins to unfold, before it abruptly freezes and the main protagonist's actor tears through the screen and declares that you must beat him in melee combat if you want to watch the rest of the film. Yeah, undoubtedly there would be people who would face defeat and use that as motivation to grow stronger and become better, but if you were really invested in the film and weren't confident in your ability to defeat your opponent, yeah, no shit, you'd start to question the limits of the situation. If I look up the actor's weaknesses on YouTube, is there anything I can utilize to my advantage? Can I bring a melee weapon without being disqualified? It is melee combat, if so, if I attach a knife to a Glock like a makeshift bayonet, does that quantify the gun as a melee weapon? If it has to be a pure one-on-one, fists only, would I be disqualified for taking performance-enhancing drugs in preparation for the encounter? If all else fails, can I consult cosmic forces vastly beyond my understanding to grant me supernatural strength so that I can finish off my opponent with minimal complications and finally finish the fucking movie? All potentially viable questions. But to transition from a player's perspective to a developer's perspective, what if you have a specific creative vision or direction in mind that may alienate or even exclude entire demographics of players? Well, in my opinion, as painful as it can be, I'm a firm believer that in order to make a truly exceptional video game, you do need to listen to player feedback, but you also need to be able to properly analyze that feedback and why players may feel the way they do, and to evaluate if/when you should stick to your creative vision. And this isn't an elitist or toxic mindset, because this is not at all exclusive to difficulty. Of course, all of this applies to easier or more casual games, but beyond that, it's something that applies to virtually every single element of game design, period. Although video games allow you to be an active participant in a fictional world to an extent that just wasn't technologically possible only half a century ago, just like every other storytelling medium, you still have to make compromises and manage your own expectations, as how much control you'll have over that world is ultimately completely predetermined. And even if only subconsciously, we all know that. Even if you're totally engrossed in a video game, you will be constantly reminded of that fact. Sometimes extremely directly. Chances are you've probably hit an invisible wall while traveling through one of your favorite games and went, damn, can't go that way. Better go somewhere else. However, I think it's also totally reasonable that many of you grew up deliberately chafing against those invisible walls, sometimes for hours on end, totally convinced that something has to be on the other side. I mean, all these characters are talking about some place that you've never been to before, and even Tommy from math class says he managed to get there, so there has to be some way to get past this nefarious obstacle. But even assuming you smash through the boundaries and storm through the burning fields, chances are you're probably not going to find an entire other continent like that asshole Tommy suggested. At best, you might find a funny Easter egg. Usually, though, you're probably just gonna phase through the ground itself and fall into infinite nothingness while staring above you at an ever-fading digital world that is completely indifferent to your current predicament, as if to say, yeah, what did you expect? Next time, just stay in the designated sandbox, idiot. But while I think there's a lot of interesting conversations to be had about games with narratives that heavily prioritize player freedom and choice, CRPGs are in my top 3 favorite genres for that exact reason, I actually find myself preferring games that have a substantially higher focus on gameplay, but directly tie the themes of said gameplay to the narrative or vice versa. And finally, all this preamble leads us to the video title. A cute little platformer I played recently called The End is nigh. But first, if I could take a moment of your time, plushies. I love them. I may sound like I have all the enthusiasm and optimism of a festering corpse, but they're legitimately one of my favorite things to buy whenever I have any amount of disposable income. So when I received an email asking if I'd be interested in creating one, of course after verifying that the sender is legitimate and the production quality wasn't just adequate but exceptional, my answer was almost an immediate yes. And I'll be honest here, I feel like I may have been a pain to work with because I asked for so many revisions, but the company was incredible to work with, and I'm incredibly happy with the end result. I mean, look at this little man. Isn't he adorable? Sometimes Bug can be a little distant because he likes having his personal time, and although nothing can truly replace his little soul, I'm always happy having this little guy stay by my side while working on these videos. But this, as well as the historical figure it's based on, is mine. I'm sorry, we cannot share custody, you cannot have my Harley Bug. However, you now have the opportunity to purchase it with a link currently displayed on screen, in the description, and the pinned comment. And I'm legitimately not interested in earning anything from this. Honest to God, if it does happen to work out, I'll probably just donate the proceeds to an animal shelter. But the opportunity to bring a bug plush to life, or I guess technically unlife, was so appealing I knew I had to dedicate fully to it. Please note that this is a limited time campaign, and we do have to sell a minimum number of bugs in order for it to enter production, so I'm going to be shilling for it a lot over the next month, but I think we can do it, with the power of friendship. Once again, if you're interested, feel free to check the link currently displayed in the description and pinned comment. But with that, let's move on to my general thoughts and feelings with The End is Nigh. I fucking hate this game. I think it fucking sucks. However, the more time I spent with it and the more I learned about its development, the more I absolutely adored it and why it was made. I sincerely believe it's one of the riskiest games ever developed, and since no one else has, I want to give it the proper spotlight it paradoxically doesn't deserve, but rightfully deserves. So while I'm playing through some of the levels in the background, I want to take this as an opportunity to talk about the developer real quick. Edmund McMillen is one of the very rare instances where I believe that I feel a parasocial connection with a creator. And by that I don't mean that I want to reach out and force him to be my friend, or that I think he is a flawless human being. I literally do not know the dude, but I honestly don't know how else to phrase this other than the more I learn about the dude, the more I think he is incredibly based. He frequently takes creative risks to the point that I don't know if I can say that because he doesn't really play anything safe. And directly on that note, he isn't afraid to leave himself emotionally vulnerable and cover dark and controversial topics that were prevalent throughout his life. He's very active in the communities that he's built up, frequently supporting and highlighting creators in those communities, which I find can be a depressingly rare trait. I mean, the dude literally reached out to the developers of an extremely successful fan-made mod for his most popular game and said something akin to,
I wanted to talk to the person in charge, basically. And I was able to contact Vin right away and like, hey, how can we work together? I told him straight out, I was like, why didn't you fucking let us know that you were working on this? Because we could have just been working together, because they worked on it for 2 years. We could have been working on this together. Like, this is really good.
And also, in no small part due to his ability to take creative risks, he tends to make incredibly good games. Incredibly fucked up games, but good games nonetheless. As I'm sure you could have noticed, I watched a bunch of his interviews during the production of my recent Binding of Isaac video, and although I respected the dude a lot already, his general demeanor and transparency really made me admire him. However, in a lot of these interviews and Q&As, one thing that came up fairly regularly was his fondness for The End Is Nigh. And I absolutely adored my time with Super Meat Boy, and especially The Binding of Isaac, but fittingly, I remember my time with The End Is Nigh being rather short-lived. I distinctly remember buying it shortly after it launched, as it came out just before my 16th birthday, and my first play session was only about half an hour before thinking to myself, wow, this game is fucking hard. I'm gonna take a break and try it again later. Which of course meant that I never touched it again. Not because I disliked the game, mind you, it was just one of the many unfortunate casualties of my Steam library backlog. But after about 7 years of dormancy, I decided to do what I call productive procrastination by delaying a vaguely important task, by subjecting myself to dying repeatedly on a different ultra-difficult cock-and-ball torture platformer. So I installed The End Is Nigh again, restarted the game, played through the first 2 stages for about 45 minutes, and yeah, I still didn't get it. I just couldn't get over this feeling that your player character was ruthlessly difficult to properly control. And I know that platformers usually have a learning curve where it may take a while to fully understand your character's movement. But unlike most other platformers, your character literally does not possess limbs, so it genuinely feels like you're helplessly flinging yourself through these nightmare hellscapes. And in retrospect, I actually adore that the game managed to make me feel that way. Stylistically, that's incredible. But in the moment, as a player who had no idea what to expect from the game, it was still very jarring nonetheless. So I decided to take a break for the night. Still determined to launch the game later, mind you, I wasn't gonna let this be another repeat of my last experience. But it was getting pretty late, and I knew that the content mines were awaiting me the next day, so I hopped onto a comfort game for an hour or so before finally heading to bed. The next day came as it always tends to do. I subjected myself to my 4,000th consecutive death on Farewell Golden, and I decided, you know what? Now that I'm apparently in the CBT platformer mood, I'm going to go ahead and play some TEIN again. That session only lasted 30 minutes and ended with me thinking, God, I just do not care for this level's gimmick at all, followed by another break. Later on, I decided to play again, got another 20 minutes in, said, okay, I'm gonna need to mentally prepare myself for whatever the fuck is going on here, and quit again. Then later again, I decided to play it a little bit more, and I went from struggling to get in a solid 30 minutes before conceding and doing something else, to playing it for 7 hours straight, completely derailing any semblance of a productive schedule, and having an incredible time. Then of course I beat the rest of the game over the next few days, and now I'm making a video about it, apparently. And to be upfront here, this video isn't going to be a standard review of the game, but I do feel like I should share my opinion on it before getting into too much depth. If you're a fan of platformers, especially difficult platformers, there is so much to love here. Compared to other similar titles though, I feel like you need to invest much more time and effort before you can begin to understand it. And persevering through that steep learning curve can feel much more frustrating than cathartic. And despite what you may think, that isn't me voicing a personal grievance. The game was intentionally designed to make the player feel that way. And although I'll be discussing that later on more favorably, ultimately I can only give the game a reluctant recommendation because even if the frustration is intentional, it's still intentionally frustrating, and that just isn't going to be everyone's thing. Honestly, this game fits in perfectly alongside other great titles like Pathologic or Fear and Hunger and the unofficial genre I would like to dub. Extremely bizarre niche games where difficulty is a main theme that's great to analyze. Asterisk, when you're not actively playing the game because it's difficult to organize your thoughts in a cohesive manner when everything in a 700-mile radius is attempting to make your life absolutely miserable. You know, the best game you've never played, or alternatively, the best game you shouldn't play. If we're being totally honest with ourselves, we could probably just go ahead and shorten the name down to video essay games instead. Like, I haven't made the title or thumbnail for this video yet, but the clickbait potential available here is astronomically high. But I digress. To get back on topic, despite everything I just said, I really can't stress enough that the gameplay doesn't suffer for its difficulty. This video isn't an excuse to justify bad gameplay or game design with my personal Davey headcanon Gunface. The End is Nigh is a stellar platformer, easily one of the best I've ever played. And even if the difficulty curve can resemble an EKG, eventually you'll begin to feel like you can control this rather unremarkable blob with your mind. And it's one thing to say that when you're controlling a character like Mario or Kirby in a game that's generally a relaxing stroll through fun and casual areas. It's another thing to say that when you're a black, cancerous blob with no limbs, stuck in hell, repeatedly dying in all sorts of horrific ways and thinking, damn, I jumped too early there. However, if this game was, you know, only an exceptional platformer, I wouldn't love it as much as I do. VVVVV is another game that I can describe as a CBT Death March platformer through hell, and I absolutely adored it. Every single good thing I can say about TEIN's gameplay is also directly applicable to that game as well. But it didn't really resonate with me in the same way despite sharing a lot of the same appeal. Which is where I can finally delve into the development of the game and what really makes The End is Nigh shine in my eyes. Why it was made and what it represents. Burnout. To quote yet another interview about the game, in the past people would say my work felt like a love letter to classic video games. I wanted The End is Nigh to walk the line of a suicide note or retirement letter. Its themes are really an abstract tale of the dark side of game development. The lonely, stressful, paranoid dregs of the creative process. Just when it seemed like the end was in sight, something else would come up and drop me lower than I already was. The End is Nigh is an exploration of this. It really became a story about my personal struggle with game development, my obsession with my work, and how it affects my family. That premise, in tandem with just how inaccessible the game is what made me absolutely adore my time with it. As evidenced by my riveting productive procrastination anecdote from earlier, I started playing the game when I was experiencing yet another creative hangover. And I'm sure if you're subscribed to the channel, you've noticed that has been a persistent issue. It's one that I'm always actively working on, but historically I've always had a difficult time maintaining a healthy work-life balance. And choosing to stick with this game during that generally unproductive and honestly depressive period was one of those resonant moments in gaming that I have a feeling is gonna stick with me for a while. Especially since I tried to get into a few other games around that time and, totally didn't delete literal days worth of scripting and recording because I tried to slot it into this video as a contrast, which completely broke the flow and pacing of it. So, on a relevant note, creative burnout. I've talked about this previously, but whenever I'm nearly finished with a project, I really start to grind out whatever comes next because I am wholly convinced that the reception of whatever I upload is going to be negative. And if I don't get ahead on whatever comes next, the negativity I receive is going to put me into a chokehold and shove me into a creative depression. Which of course is an incredibly stupid mindset that only perpetuates what I'm trying to avoid. And I think a perfect example of that is Autism and Robots, which despite the incredibly vague title, is easily the most personal video I've ever made, and one that I uploaded expecting an immensely negative reception. And as you may have guessed, the response to that video was the most overwhelmingly positive I've ever seen on an upload. I became a full-time community representative for my own channel, reading and responding to comments for upwards of 9 hours a day because so many people were leaving kind, genuine, and emotionally potent comments and stories that deserve to be shared and supported. I couldn't confidently say that it's my best video, but it was easily the most proud and legitimately fortunate I've ever felt as a creator. Paradoxically though, after that video was released and it wasn't a failure and I began production on my next video, guess what? I frequently ran into motivational walls because I was convinced it sucks and that's not good enough and that isn't unique enough and I don't know what I'm doing and how in the fuck do I have this thing? And yes, to be meta, I am currently scripting this out to avoid having to work on that video. Just like the exact goddamn video that inadvertently led to me making this one in the first place. In fact, funnily enough, I have to add upon this because since I first typed this out, I released another video with the express purpose of it being a rest from rampant perfectionism ruining my productivity. It was a challenge run on a campaign that I featured on the channel several times before and one that I already knew was possible. I beat the mission months before the video uploaded. If you're curious about what happened during those months, it was basically just infinitely replaying the mission to make sure that almost every technicality is accounted for. And I guess to be totally fair, the video was incredibly well received. It performed far better than I could have ever anticipated, but I'd say at least 2/3 of the workload was completely unnecessary and only really proved how toxic I am to myself. Which is why I find the development history and the storyline of The End is Nigh completely resonant. Edmund has gone on record to state that this was the most personal and cathartic project he's ever worked on. Which, of course, that catharsis could only come from having to navigate through some incredibly dark periods full of self-doubt and uncertainty, but I really need you to keep in mind that this is a dude who made a game where you play as a naked child who blames himself for his parents' divorce, in no small part because of intense religious scrutiny from his overzealous mother, who refuses to even allow him to escape to his imagination without being abused, which culminates in him suffocating himself in his empty toy chest, attempting to escape from the life of sin that his mother falsely projected onto him. which of course was based on Edmund's experiences with his born-again Christian family that shamed him for his interests and creativity, regularly with the promise of eternal damnation. So saying that this isn't his most personal project is not a small claim to make. Like, I'm not saying this as a critique or a gotcha. I think it's incredibly well made, but last year while editing I watched a video titled How Isaac Was Made and Designed to Fail, and that is still 100% true, mind you, but if that game was made to fail, well, to quote the big man himself, the end is nigh may as well be a suicide note. But what I found particularly interesting is that I believe the game itself reflects the creator's intended themes excellently. In most other titles, even ones with depressing or at times nihilistic storylines, you're given all the tools available to succeed, and the developer usually wants you to succeed. Even in the first video game ever created to introduce the concept of difficulty to the medium, the game is designed in such a way to indirectly, albeit harshly, guide the player through the seemingly insurmountable challenges presented before them. And because of that, the player retention is remarkably consistent. If you look at The End is Nigh, on the other hand, the achievement stats are dire to say the least. Only 67% of players manage to beat the first zone, which in of itself is a disproportionately high drop-off considering that this takes maybe 45 minutes to an hour at most, and that's if you're playing with a completionist mindset. But then that drops off by 15% all the way down to 52% for the second zone, then another 12% drop off for the third zone for 40%, then there's a split where depending on the route you take, another 12 to 15% drops off, so anywhere between 25 to 28%. Then the number of players who went through all three of the routes drops all the way down to 20%. And without spoiling too much here, I would consider that to be the halfway point for the game, not including extras, and trust me when I say that achievement marks a change in the game's philosophy that only twists the knife even further. I'll get into more depth about that shortly, but the point I want to get at here is that the retention is fucking grim. And that was intentional. I wanted to make a game about stress and anxiety, and I wanted to make a game about a life falling apart. I wrote this character who just happens to be around after the world has completely ended. It's about agoraphobia. It's about finally forcing yourself out and then questioning your actions. And then things get harder. And then things get harder, and then things get harder. And then when you think it's over, it's not over. And it keeps going, and it keeps going, and it keeps going. And you either give up, or you persevere. There was something there I was playing with, and that is not a smart thing to do with game design if you want to sell a game. I did see people give up. Say, fuck it, Edmund, I can't do this, I'm sorry. It's one of my most inaccessible games. But one of my best. Now, don't get me wrong. As a creator, you do usually want your projects to be successful. But especially in the modern day, where everything seems to be a competition, where even the very notion of choosing to be content in life is seen as lazy or uninspired, it is critical to appreciate the creative process and how you personally feel about what you've made. If you ask any creator out there what their favorite project was, I'd say about 95 to 98% of the time, it just isn't going to be their most successful or popular endeavor. In fact, a lot of the time it's going to be something that did poorly, or didn't live up to expectations, or was generally overlooked. The weird thing about creation is that you are perpetually stuck in your own mind about everything you make, which can result in you losing sight of why you even enjoy doing what you do to begin with. It's incredibly easy to intentionally draw a piece of shit and go, haha, wow, this looks garbage, before throwing it in the trash and hoping you forget about it the day after. But when you sit there for days, weeks, months, or even years creating something, then after all that turmoil and stress is over, and you're finally ready to unveil to the world what you've created, and the sentiment echoed back is only apathetic, if not actively hostile and belittling, that is goddamn soul-crushing. Now, from a more objective point of view, it should be noted that this experience can be imperative towards creating something brilliant. You do need to fail in order to truly succeed, but at that moment, while you're experiencing the aftermath of everything you've worked on crumbling apart in deafening silence, it can be incredibly difficult to look back on that as anything else than a waste of time. But the overall success and popularity of a project isn't inherently indicative of its value. As I've described earlier, I believe that in order to create something that's truly authentic and deeply resonates with people, you're going to have to alienate a substantial portion of your potential audience who will end up disliking it. And as backhanded and borderline pretentious as this is going to sound, I genuinely do not think this game could have been anywhere near as impactful to me if it was a mainstream success. And admittedly, I've really had to grapple with the idea that I might simply be overreading elements of the game, but I do believe that a lot of this is intentional, even if never outwardly confirmed. For example, do you know what is unironically one of the most effective mantras? Just do the thing. So many people refuse to even get started on their creative journeys because they convince themselves that whatever they have to make has to be perfect, but that just isn't how things work. Unlike the people who wrote the general outline or the first few pages of a book just to tell themselves that they'll return to it tomorrow or when they have more free time before it becomes a fleeting, distant memory, or the people who dislike their first drawings or paintings so much that years later they can only look back on it as an embarrassment that has best remained buried. The greatest creators never gave up. They would make a thing that was probably garbage, but they'd continue to make garbage until they eventually collected a vague understanding of what they were doing and began to make things that probably weren't garbage. Progress is never a linear path up. You'll undoubtedly make mistake after mistake after mistake, but you should bounce back from those mistakes and continue to do what you love because you love doing it. And in the case of The End is Nigh, the motto of just do the thing isn't just applicable to getting through it, but I believe it's wonderfully reflected through these little collectible tumors. Despite what you may think, I'm not much of an achievement guy. I do love replaying my favorite games, and I do love challenging myself during those replays to see what's possible with the meta-knowledge I've accumulated. But it is also incredibly easy to permanently tarnish your perception of a game by striving for 100% completion, so once I realize I'm no longer having fun by pushing myself to reach increasingly arbitrary goals, I tend to tap out and move on. And in regards to platformers, without proper discretion or purpose, it can become blatantly obvious when the collectibles were an afterthought that even the level designers grew tired of. Don't get me wrong, when used correctly, they are an invaluable tool to keep players engaged, but there are definitely moments where you can practically see some poor, overworked developer scrambling to meaningfully integrate the arbitrary quota of thingamajigs required per stage, before giving up entirely and either placing it in the middle of goddamn nowhere or directly on the intended path so that they can go home and maybe get 5 hours of sleep that night. Fortunately, I'd say that The End is Nigh manages to avoid that trajectory by making the acquisition of cancerous tumors an incredibly fun endeavor for the whole family. And the game is significantly better with their inclusion. However, it also needs to be said that collecting these can be an absolute bastard. Do you see this stage? It has been a year since I've recorded this, and I'm still haunted by it. I said that line, and this just appeared in my mind like a PTSD flashback. Holy shit, fuck this stage. But ultimately, These are collectibles. They're there for an optional challenge, but they're never required for progression. Personally, I got about half of them before deciding to blitz straight through the levels. Not out of disinterest or frustration, mind you. I mean, besides this, Jesus fucking Christ, but I was having a great time and I just wanted to see more of the new stages. And this is a good time to mention the story of the game. Not the story of the game's development, but the in-game story itself. I briefly covered this in a previous segment, but the game runs with themes of agoraphobia and forcing yourself out into the unknown. But fortunately, there's a rather simple motivator for this hell march. Our boy wants a friend. It's the post-apocalypse, he's lonely, he spent God knows how long live streaming to nobody, and he can't even do that anymore. So we're gonna make a friend. Literally, we're gonna gather body parts to create someone to hopefully alleviate the horrors of this cruel existence. So I persevered through the depths of the Hollows and Golgotha for the body, climbed the Wall of Sorrow before boarding the SS Exodus for the head, before finally managing to conquer the machine to obtain the heart. And after literally going through hell and back to make our new friend, I'm happy to say that things have only gotten substantially worse because he betrays you and the world ends. Again. We're in the post-apocalypse now, and things are somehow even worse than they already were. Incredible. But while I was sitting there processing this top 10 anime betrayal, something hit me. I mean, obviously the depths of hell wasn't an ideal location to introduce myself to my new potential friend, so it was only natural that we went back home. My cold, dilapidated, depressing home where everything began. Fuck! We're at the beginning again, aren't we? We've made zero progress. In fact, we've miraculously made negative progress because we have to get all the way back here. But of course, all the stages are significantly more difficult now. This in of itself is already a massive fuck you, but if you decide to persist in the doomed world you have created, you may glance over to the top left of your screen and your peripheral vision catches something else. A realization so dreadful that it crushed the spirit of even the most dedicated players. Those tumors you may or may not have been collecting, those are your lives now. And if you haven't been going out of your way to get them, you have made everything for yourself so much harder here. Even if you're like me and got a few hundred of these before this realization, it's easy to fail on one of these brutally difficult stages and ponder just how much easier things would be if you'd have done things differently. If you'd have done more earlier, maybe things would be better right now, which is genuinely just one of the most human experiences you can have. But the difficult thing is, although it is immensely beneficial to go back for them, you don't have to get all of the collectibles. Ultimately, you have to draw your own line in the sand to decide what is enough and what is fair for you. And this type of internal conflict is very common in the creative process. Something you're going to have to confront is that if you want to make pretty much anything, there is always going to be things that are cut or scrapped during development. But I think something that isn't talked about enough is just how much time and effort is lost when you finally decide that something is no longer worth pursuing. And finalizing those decisions is easily one of the most difficult things you'll have to do as a creator. But in one of the most meta things I've ever seen a game do, you can be completely adamant in your mentality to ignore that and try to do everything. Which is completely self-destructive. Everybody needs rest, and if you deny yourself that, then whatever you aspire to do will be impacted negatively. And striving for greater and greater goals is healthy, but you really should examine why and how you're doing it. Of course it's good to prepare for the future and to look out for yourself, but it's also totally possible for you to completely disregard your own health and happiness in pursuit of a goal or ambition that may not even be worth it. Because it's incredibly easy to convince yourself that reaching a specific milestone will solve your current ailments, and it's incredibly easy to hold on to that belief as motivation to push forward even when times are tough. But you may not even realize that you've subconsciously merged your adorations with your disappointments into a perpetually shifting goalpost that you can try to pursue until all of your previous and current accomplishments become arbitrary achievements that prove nothing, until you're inevitably set back. But what I find so sinister about burnout is that it's not impossible for those vulnerable, depressing periods to perpetuate themselves by becoming something you attempt to avoid by making the same exact mistakes. But of course the end is nigh as a video game, so unlike real life, you can go back to the previous levels to try again with a new perspective. Of course this doesn't make sense narratively, but I think there is a genuinely optimistic takeaway there that makes sense both mechanically and thematically. It is totally possible to persist in this doomed world that you have created, but it's also totally possible to go back to the beginning, to effectively restart and go back to the basics. And those initial moments of frustration born from unfair gameplay or bullshit mechanics are now completely trivial and actually really fun. In fact, I'd argue that this gameplay loop is even encouraged, as in one of the last levels before the post-apocalypse, you unlock a collectible key that can be used in previous levels to gain even more tumors. I think it's excellent game design as it encourages you to slow down, take a step back, and really take in the previous levels, which helps convey just how much you've improved since you've begun your journey, which isn't as evident when you're struggling in your future hellscape, and that sense of affirmation really helps towards making the last stretches of the game more manageable and approachable, on top of being reinforced by the extra lives you're getting. It's an incredible, positive feedback loop that I think is actually kind of applicable to real life. When you're struggling, you may not realize just how much you've done. You may even amount yourself to a failure who's done nothing with their lives. But I find that if you take a step back, look at where you are and what you've overcome and just how much you've grown over the years, those pervasive feelings of hopelessness and restlessness can quickly pass, and I love how that's portrayed here. But let's assume a worst case scenario here. Let's say that out of frustration or anxiety, you forced yourself to find all 450 hidden collectibles. This will undoubtedly make things significantly easier for the future, but it would be delusional to state that there weren't immense diminishing returns there. And once you reach the final stage, appropriately named Acceptance, where you finally confront your mistake, you also have the option to just not do that. To further delude yourself into sacrificing all of your blood, sweat, and tears into a failure that you've clung onto out of desperation despite everything going against your best interests. And refusing to accept that reveals the real last stage of the game. But I think you can see the problem here. Those collectibles were your lives, and after enduring so much unnecessary suffering to get all of them, you chose to sacrifice all of that for, oh no. Yeah, the stage fucking sucks, and everything is miserable, and it's awful, and I hate it, and I really don't want to be here. Yet, it's one of the most perfect examples of perfectionism becoming self-destructive I have ever seen. It just wasn't good enough to do everything you possibly could've. Now you're forcing yourself to surpass what was ever considered realistic because of your inability to recognize what you've accomplished. To actually treat yourself with the kindness and respect you deserve, and to be able to look at what you've done and feel proud of it. In fact, this is very directly foreshadowed throughout the game. There are a few optional segments in which you're able to visit the future, which have the same exact aesthetic and difficulty as Nevermore. And just like Nevermore, they're cleverly locked behind meeting tumor thresholds. First 50, then 100, then 170, and then 300. And completing them is one of the only ways you can secure more than 450 tumors. But you probably shouldn't do that. Of course, there's the narrative implications of, hey, this is what your future will look like if you continue down this path, you should probably stop. And the collectible cartridges being named after the first 4 stages of grief isn't particularly subtle either. But there's also the mechanical implication of knowing what the future will hold, how painful it'll be, and putting yourself through even more pain just to try and get through it regardless. And let me be the first to tell you, these fucking suck. I mean, the process of unlocking the cartridges is fine, because even if it is extremely difficult and you're going to die a lot, they are extremely short, so I don't think they overstay their welcome. That cannot be said for the cartridges, though. Holy fuck. Similarly to how putting yourself through unnecessary torment for the future was harsh, this is also totally unnecessary and god-awful. The tumors provided are exceptionally low for how challenging they are, and again, your effort has immense diminishing returns here. I mean, fuck, you literally start with 0 lives with no way to further increase them, so the parallels aren't exactly subtle here. To be fair, I did some of the easier ones, and I'd say that overall they are immensely valuable. Starting Nevermore with 10 lives is just infinitely easier than starting it with 0. But the cartridges very quickly ramp up to difficulty that far surpasses anything in the base game, and it just isn't particularly worth it besides seeing that 100% completion score. But I mean, if you're here, being pragmatic probably isn't your strong suit, so who's gonna stop you? But if you choose to continue down this abundantly self-destructive route, quadrupling down on your mistakes and never allowing yourself to move on and feel at peace, you get to look forward to the hidden ending of the game. Where you're absorbed into this Hellflesh abomination, your journey ends and you can look back and reminisce on your life. Probably for all eternity. It is not at all worth it. You dedicate your everything, your entire being, into something that just didn't work, and everything is worse because of your inability to let go. But, of course, this isn't the true ending. The true ending was all the way back here, in acceptance. And in order to unlock it, you have to confront your failure, but this time you have to finally leave it behind you. Which the gameplay reflects incredibly well by forcing you to turn back and play through the entire stage in reverse because acceptance isn't simple to reach. It's rather infamously the final stage of grief for a reason. And something I absolutely adore about this is that when you're playing through this level normally, on the last few screens you're being drawn towards this room as a way to symbolize that the end is nigh. But when you decide to turn back, you're still being drawn towards it. You have to actively fight against it in order to move forwards, which I think is fucking brilliant. Add on a strict timer that only further reinforces any feelings of doubt, stress, or anxiety you may be feeling, and you somehow have a platforming experience that's as exhilarating as it is symbolic. And hey, guess what? If you manage to overcome your inner turmoils and return to the beginning, you die anyway. Ultimately, it was too late. You can rationalize what you could have done differently, what decisions you could have made to prevent this, but that's the thing about acceptance. And although it isn't always possible, you should take the lessons learned from your mistakes towards the future and try to be better. And this is really silly, but this is where I have to return to a much earlier point in the video. I said previously that I beat the game and even displayed my achievement stats, but there's undoubtedly a few people who noticed that I never showcased the achievement for completing the game. And that's because for the longest time, I just flat out refused to. I could've. I was literally at the end with minutes to spare, but I decided to kill myself repeatedly just before reaching acceptance to be meta. To make a joke at my own expense, mocking my own shortcomings. But I realized later that this kind of only perpetuates my inner struggles. Sure, I may be aware of the problem, but I'm not taking any steps to resolve it. So you know what? Fuck it. I went back, died a few dozen more times, actually finished the level, and watched as everything I've struggled with abruptly ended. In oddly comforting silence. And I think it's only fitting for the video to end here as well. I love this game. Even if I had to experience the story via dying repeatedly in hell as a limbless black blob of cancer, I had a great time. And I'm extremely thankful for its existence. Admittedly, I know from an unbiased external perspective this probably seems like a very silly video, but I'm not kidding when I say it legitimately helped revitalize my interest in creation after an incredibly depressing period in my life. And in an almost full circle moment, I sincerely don't care how well this video does. In fact, I'm kind of hoping that it does poorly. I didn't make this for wide appeal or analytics. I'd have scrapped it long ago if that was ever my intention. This was purely a passion project to help dig myself out of creative burnout, and in that regard, it was an immense success. And I'm not gonna let any algorithm or analytics try to persuade me otherwise. But, as always, I wanted to thank you for watching. I know I say this in like every other video, but with this being the longest period without new content ever, I appreciate your support and patience immensely, and I don't want to take it for granted. Fortunately, it's not going to be too much longer before another upload, as once again, I'm trying to make sure the bug plush comes to fruition, so I'm going to be uploading a few more videos this month to try to make it happen. And I sincerely hope you enjoy the videos soon to come. And likewise, I sincerely hope you have an incredible rest of your day. And thank you for everything, really. I mean that. I wouldn't be here without you, and there isn't a day that goes by where I take that for granted. So, thank you. Heart emoji.